Dear participants, ministry representatives, and colleagues, I welcome you to the PtX Hub Berlin session at the Transport and Climate Change Week 2022. In 1 hour, we will discuss the topic of PtX in transport, on how to tackle defossilizing in shipping and aviation to reach net zero. The PtX Hub is a knowledge and exchange platform to promote the global market ramp-up of PtX for climate protection and sustainable development. The German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection established the PtX Hub in 2019 with the aim of Mr. von Meyer is senior consultant at the PtX Hub and expert on the topic of sustainability. His focus is on developing international networks, regulatory frameworks, and sustainability standards, ensuring that hydrogen PtX policies and projects contribute to achieving climate neutrality and the SDGs. After Mr. von Meyer's presentation, Ms. Sonia Rueda will present the PtX in aviation. Mrs. Rueda works as advisor at the PtX Hub of the GIZ in Berlin, with focus on solution for the aviation sector and the chemical industry. She is passionate about sustainable solutions and actions that contribute solving one of the biggest problems facing our society today, climate change. The last presentation will be held by Lukas Peiler. Mr. Peiler works as a consultant for the PtX Hub with a particular focus on the shipping and aviation sectors. With his degree in mechanical engineering from RWTH Aachen University in Germany, he mainly focuses his work on technical issues. Mr. Peiler's contribution to a carbon-neutral future include the creation of a resource calculator for renewable fuels and a study on well-to-wake costs for alternative ship propulsion. Each presentation is followed by a Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to write it in the chat on the right next to the live stream. I will then pose your question directly to the speaker. So with no further ado, I now give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. von Meyer.
Well, thank you, Carla. And it's great to have the opportunity to present our work at the PtX Hub to the Transport and Climate Change Week. Our session is actually about how to get to Paris, or as the title is, going the last mile to reach net zero. And we will learn that PtX, Power to X, is playing a crucial role in this journey. My introduction will focus on the PtX Hub, briefly explaining what the hub does, and then on the why and how of PtX before I address PtX sustainability in its different dimensions: environmental, economic, social, and governance. The PtX Hub is a platform for knowledge creation and exchange, for policy dialogue and cooperation, and we are working on the breakthrough of sustainable Power-to-X and green hydrogen solutions around the globe. We work with governments, industry, think tanks, and CSOs, civil society organizations, and we focus on international networks and cooperations, on sustainability, and on capacity building and knowledge transfer. And we offer a whole range of background information. You will get a copy of this presentation, and here you can click the various links on our website. It is about cutting-edge research, as well as the entire global network of 120 countries where GIZ is working. It is offering training workshops on PtX and expertise on sustainability, and also advisory on partnerships and financing of Power-to-X. Why do we need PtX? The challenge is climate neutrality by 2050. The Paris target is to not exceed 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and ideally going down to 1.5. So on the left, you see the current global energy-related CO2 emissions and their distribution on the different sectors. And the challenge is not to go business as usual, but to dramatically decline the emissions. And you see the different shares of buildings, transport, and other sectors for closing the Paris delta. But for that, we need to dramatically increase energy efficiency and improve it in all sectors. We need renewable energy, and increasingly towards 100%. And thirdly, we need electrification whenever possible, so including cars and light-duty transport. But as you can see, this is not enough. There is a loophole here, and we have to achieve net zero by 2050. And to do that, we absolutely need green hydrogen and, more broadly, Power-to-X for those sectors of industry and transport that can hardly be directly electrified, or actually currently not. So how does Power-to-X work? This is a nice animated graph starting with renewable electricity generation combined with water in an electrolyzer. The electrolysis produces H2, hydrogen, and if it's produced with renewable energy, it is green hydrogen. But the story doesn't end here. If you combine hydrogen with, for example, CO2 in a PtX synthesis unit, you can create a kind of syncrude which will result in either solid or gas or liquid PtX, and this PtL can then be used either as e-kerosene for aviation, or as e-diesel, or as ammonia in shipping. My colleagues, Sonia and Lukas, will go further into detail with regard to aviation and shipping. But I would like to move on and ask, how can we ensure that this process is also not just green, but sustainable in a more comprehensive understanding? And for that, we have created a framework, which we call the EESG framework, which has an environmental dimension, an economic dimension, a social dimension, and an overarching governance dimension. And we assess sustainability both at the product level as well as at the project and processes level and at the policy level. So for each of those 4 dimensions, we have clustered the multitude of concerns into 4 subgroups, so-called clusters of concerns, reaching in the environmental boxes dimension here, from energy and carbon issues to water, land and biodiversity, to resources and pollution, and then the economic, the social, and the governance concerns. Now, let's bring those two dimensions together. And here we have our graph again. And let's briefly look at what are the issues we have to address when we talk and develop Power-to-X projects and products. It all starts with energy, and in particular electricity. It's clear it must be renewable. However, this is not enough. It must be additional renewable. If it's just taken from the grid, it will have to be replaced by fossil fuels, and therefore we have not won anything. So the electricity must be renewable and additional to the normal trajectory in the energy transition of the country. So this is power generation. Now comes water. While we have wind and sun, we often don't have enough water. So there might be water stress. So the footprint of water needs must be considered, and in many cases, it will not work without desalination, creating further environmental challenges. In the electrolysis, there are issues that very rare critical minerals are used and needed, and their production and refinement is concentrated in very few countries. So again, from a sustainability perspective, something one should have an eye on. And clearly, on the whole process, we need environmental impact assessments. For the PtX synthesis, what is crucial is to look at the carbon sources. Where does the CO2 come from? And we need to rely on closed carbon cycles and not on fossils. But it's not just the production of Power-to-X products that matters. The transportation needs to be assessed, because if you produce it in those regions with a lot of wind and sun, let's say in North Africa, then it still needs to be transported to Europe if export is the option. However, there is often an overemphasis on exports, and the Power-to-X Hub is focusing very strongly on how the countries can use Power-to-X also for their domestic development. And in that logic, it matters also if it comes into conflict with energy poverty, which is still an issue in many countries in Africa, where still half the population is not connected to the grid. Water supply, are there trade-offs? And of course, PtX may create jobs, but we need the proper qualifications, and the labor standards must be met. I'll move on quickly. We need to look at the value chains, the energy transition challenges, and take those into account when we ramp up the markets, either for domestic or for export purposes. And last slide, the governance dimension. Countries need to document their commitment in hydrogen strategies or PtX roadmaps, which must be compatible with the Paris NDCs. Crucial is the participation of stakeholders and their involvement. And finally, we need regulatory frameworks such as certification, and then maybe also book and claim systems, something which Sonia will address in her presentation. With that, thank you for your attention, and you have my coordinates. I'm happy to respond to questions also after the very short time left for questions and answers now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since there are no questions yet in the chat, I have one question that I would like to...
Clear. But I don't know the question, so come on.
So you mentioned that many things are important concerning sustainability and PtX, but is there one aspect that is of especially high relevance? And if yes, why?
Well, first of all, I think I wanted to show that sustainability is more than just environment. Crucial, I think I've made that point, is that the energy is renewable and that it doesn't interfere negatively with the energy transition in the country. So there should be an additional element. Definitely, we have to look at water and land access rights. There are technical solutions, but again, if you do desalination, it needs careful environmental impact assessment. But what my main message would be, don't forget the economic development opportunity, and don't only look at environment, and put special emphasis on the social dimension. How are people and communities involved, and how do we create co-benefits? As I said, desalination can also help to solve water problems for local populations and for farming. It can create jobs, but for that we need skills. So we need coherent, comprehensive development approaches, and for that participation of stakeholders is needed. So it's not just the one issue, but a coherent set, and the PtX Hub is doing exactly this, trying to bring together all those dimensions, and we are happy to discuss and exchange with partners from all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very detailed answer. And I would have another question regarding the responsibility of the mentioned dimensions. So who's responsible for ensuring that sustainability is met along the PtX value chain?
Well, obviously it should be governments, but they have to set the regulatory frameworks first. But this is the duty to protect or set the frameworks for governments. However, it is also industry that is responsible for meeting it, and they have to establish the appropriate conditions for ensuring that there is due diligence along the entire value chain, and businesses are more and more prepared to actually take on that responsibility. And there is finally a role for civil society organizations, and we need to create settings in which they have voice and are heard.
Thank you very much. So if there are no further questions, I would like to hand over to Sonia to give us a deeper look at our first mode of transport that we will talk about today, the aviation sector.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. So I will share my presentation now. And yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. And good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Sonia Rueda. I am an advisor at the PtX Hub. And today I will talk about the options and alternatives that we have to defossilize aviation. So I will start with a brief overview of the CO2 emissions in the sector, the tools that we have to defossilize the sector, and with focus on alternative fuels, especially synthetic fuels or power to liquids. And finally, I will close with a short overview about book and claim scheme. So currently, aviation is a fossil sector. 99.9% of the fuels consumed by the sector are of fossil origin. A similar situation is happening also in sectors like iron and steel, the chemical industry, and the shipping sector. So there is a lot to do with these sectors. And currently, the emissions of the aviation sector have reached 1 gigaton per year and is expected to rise. We also must think about other types of emissions. We have CO2 emissions, but we also have emissions related to nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, and soot. But for this presentation, we will focus on CO2 emissions. So in the aviation sector, we have 3 main applications, so to speak, in civil aviation. And the first one is the short haul. So it means flights that are below 1,500 kilometers. For this application, we normally use regional aircrafts and narrow body aircrafts. And they are such as the ones that we see on the picture. So on the top right and the second one. So these are small and medium-sized aircrafts. And for this application, we count on about 30% of the CO2 emissions of the sector. For medium haul applications, so between 1,500 kilometers to 4,000 kilometers, we have about 40% of the whole emissions in the sector. And for this, normally medium-sized aircrafts are used. And for long haul, so beyond 4,000 kilometers, we use the wide body aircrafts, so like the last one on the pictures. And for this application, we see about 30% of the emissions. And so as we see, we have different aircrafts for different applications. And so we will have different solutions for each one of these applications if we want to defossilize the sector. So what are the tools that we have to defossilize aviation? Well, first we have the option of optimization of flight and ground operations. That means optimizations of air traffic and trajectories. That's one measure, but also the electrification of ground operations and the fuel transport optimization. And that's one of the aims of the PtX Hub, or the main topics that we are talking or we are working on. We also have policy and market instruments such as carbon pricing, carbon taxation, trading schemes, pricing differentiation, and alternatives to air transport, and also book and claim schemes. We have regulatory measures. We also have technological innovation, in this case, new propulsion systems, disruptive aircraft designs, but also alternative fuels like electricity, hydrogen, and sustainable aviation fuels, and also the hybrid technologies or the combination of them. So for the alternative fuels, we can look at them in the energy efficiency pathway. So normally what we think is that electrifying the applications is the most efficient way of going first if we are using renewable energies. So direct electrification comes in the first picture, but there are options that cannot be electrified yet. And for those options, we should go for green molecules. Green molecules are molecules produced by using renewable energy, such as green hydrogen. That's the simpler molecule that can be produced, or more complex molecules like synthetic kerosene or sustainable aviation fuels. Well, in terms of efficiency, we see that direct electrification is the way to go, but we are not yet prepared for that. We don't have the technology and the energy density that is required for these applications. So these first two applications, electrification and green hydrogen, are non-drop-in options. That means they cannot use the infrastructure that is already available. And that's a problem if we need to act right now. The sustainable aviation fuels, on the other hand, can use the infrastructure that is already available in the airports and also the aircrafts that are already there. So the idea here is that we need to work in parallel in all the solutions that are available to be able to defossilize the sector on time. But yeah, with all these new developments, the aviation sector will have a new look. These are options that have been developed. These are electric airplanes that have been developed and are in a concept phase or even in model phase. This is an option that would use hydrogen in fuel cells. And these are the options from Airbus to use hydrogen either in a fuel cell or direct combustion of hydrogen. And here we have the options that are exploring the use of 100% sustainable aviation fuels. So, well, the alternatives that we have are there, but the time frame is really short. So, for example, for short distances, below 1,500 kilometers, we have the option of using sustainable aviation fuels, and we see that electric or hydrogen fuel cell applications will come into the picture in about a decade. These are the options that can be electrified in a near future, but as we see in the table, for medium-haul and long-haul applications, sustainable aviation fuels are the main solution. We see that there is potential for some hydrogen to come into the picture by 2040, but by now what we have is sustainable aviation fuels. And so, well, the options to defossilize the sector are basically these ones that we have, and 61% of the CO2 reductions are planned to happen with sustainable aviation fuels. We have a target, there is a target of net zero by mid-century in the European Union, and well, we need to act right now if we want to reach this target on time. But when we talk about sustainable aviation fuels, it is important to differentiate between power-to-liquids or synthetic fuels and biofuels, because they have different pathways of production. And in our case, we are talking about synthetic fuels. As Heino already explained, to produce synthetic fuels, we need water, we need carbon dioxide, and we need additional renewables. With this, we can produce a synthetic crude that then will be refined and will produce the synthetic kerosene that is used in aviation. So how can we really go or improve the deployment of the sustainable aviation fuels? One of the options that have been proposed is the book and claim scheme. And here, the concept is basically to go for the regions where PTL can be produced in a sustainable way, following the criteria that Heino already mentioned in his presentation, and start producing the sustainable aviation fuel there. And the point is to separate the physical product from the emission reduction certificates. Why? Well, this will open the door for a new market. And the point is that there are clients that are willing to get the sustainable aviation fuels and to pay a premium price for them, but they don't have to use the fuel themselves. And that's the key part of the book and claim scheme. We don't have to transport fuels if it's not completely necessary. That would help in the introduction of the sustainable aviation fuels. So it means, for example, if the fuel is produced in a country and is used in this country, the emissions reduction certificates can be traded in a registry that will have a compliance part and that will create a market for other industries or other customers that want to deal with these emissions reduction certificates and acquire them. So this is the option of book and claim. This could help with the development of sustainable aviation fuels in developing countries, and could help also developing new infrastructure and new opportunities for countries. But again, it's important to take into account the sustainability criteria to develop this type of technologies. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. And yeah, well, I will be willing to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for this really interesting presentation. I would have one question. So just going back again on the topic of electrifying airplanes, because we know that also in terms of sustainability, electrification has to come before converting the electricity into anything else. So could you explain again why direct electrification is not an option yet in the sector?
Yeah, well, as we saw, it's not an option yet because basically the energy density of the batteries and the storage systems that we have right now is not good enough for applications such as medium and long haul. So what we see right now is the emerging applications for small aircrafts. And this will happen in the future. We see electrification as a long-term solution, but we need to think of the infrastructure. And I think infrastructure is the key answer right now. If we want to reach the 2050 target, we don't have enough time to build infrastructure before that target year. So this is one of the main reasons, but of course it's on the table and we support any development on that direction.
Thank you very much. Yes. And then maybe one more question, again, going more into detail into book and claim, because it is an alternative in order to not bring the fuels physically to the respective airports. But can you maybe explain again more detailed about that option and why it makes sense to focus on it?
Absolutely. So, well, the point with book and claim is that normally if we want to produce sustainable aviation fuels, there are some countries that have better resources for that and have a better picture in terms of also sustainability. For those countries, it would be easier to produce these fuels. But the point is, if we produce the fuel in region like, let's say, Brazil, and then we have to transport this fuel to Europe, this will increase the CO2 footprint of the fuel that we are using. So this doesn't really make sense if we want to reduce emissions. So what we are proposing is, with book and claim, that the fuel is produced in this country, like Brazil, and can be used there, but the emission reduction certificates can be traded and can be allocated into well, companies that are in other parts of the world. So this would allow emissions reductions without the need of transporting fuel. And really, transporting fuel is not a great option when we know that transporting will increase the CO2 footprint of this fuel. So that's the reason behind the claim.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question. I think we also have time for it. So can you tell how much renewable energy would be needed to produce enough sustainable aviation fuels for the whole flight industry?
Well, that's a very tough question because, well, it will depend on the renewable energy availability and the region we are talking about. But definitely, this is something that is, well, it will require a lot of renewable energy. And then we need to think of the regions of the world where renewables or where the grid is already renewable, 100% renewable. There we know that there is an extra production of renewables, and that is what can be used, for example, to produce this type of fuels. So I don't have a number right now, well written, but what we can say is that first, it will be a lot of renewable electricity. And secondly, this electricity or this renewable should not interfere with the energy transition of the countries. So in this case, it should be additional renewable. And we know that there is a big challenge to have additional renewable in a global scale. So, well, we have to think of these issues as well. And yeah, well, it's one of the considerations for the deployment of these technologies.
And then we have one last question about the comparison between transporting hydrogen to airports and to ports. So the question is, what do you see as the supply chain and logistic challenges for delivering hydrogen to airports? For seaports, it might be easier because we have quite a lot of experience with bunkering, especially LNG, which can be guiding for designing hydrogen supply and storage chains.
Yeah, well, this is one of the main challenges, how to deal with green hydrogen logistics. And again, well, this is why hydrogen or direct electrification is not yet in the near future pictured, because this is a huge problem or, well, challenge for the industry. We need to develop this infrastructure. And of course, we cannot use any pipeline. So there is already a lot of work going on in terms of developing pipelines and systems to storage the hydrogen. So hydrogen storage and transportation is it's one of the key challenges also for the infrastructure in airports. Right now, there are some developments, but of course, each solution depends on the context we are talking about and what are the ports nearby and what could be the best option for green hydrogen storage and logistics. So again, this is one of the biggest challenges. There is work done, but yeah, it's not a simple solution. There is no one straightforward answer.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to hand over to Lukas, who is telling us more now about the shipping industry and how we can defossilise that one. Thank you, Sonia.
Welcome.
Cool. Thank you, Carla. And hello to everybody. My name is Lukas Peiler, and I work as an external consultant in the field of maritime transport for the PtX Hub. And today I will show you the possibilities and challenges of Power-to-X in maritime transport. Thank you as well, Heino and Sonia, for your inputs. Really interesting to hear about it. Right now, we are changing in our session the means of transports from planes to ships. So let's hop on board. So why do we focus on maritime transport? Maritime transport is responsible for roughly 2.6% of global CO2 emissions. Together with sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides emissions, this adds up to more or less 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This makes the shipping industry having more or less the same impact on climate as the aviation industry. But there is constructive space on ships to install alternative, less carbon-intensive technologies. And this has already been proven in forms of model ships that use, for example, hybrid motors or even pure electric motors. So we have high greenhouse gas emissions, but as well the possibility to do something about it. This gives us a big potential to reduce emissions. So what has been done until now to reduce those emissions and to incite more alternatives? Well, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has declared its goal to reduce overall emissions by at least 50% until the year of 2050. To achieve this, mandatory measures have been implemented. Under MARPOL, that's the IMO's Pollution Prevention Treaty, most interesting is the Energy Efficiency Design Index. This index specifies a maximum carbon footprint for the capacity of newly built ships. This index has becoming stricter since 2015, as you can see on the right side. This bottom orange line depicts the limit for the year 2025 regarding the size of the vessel. The red dots are data points from newly built ships from the years 2013 to 2017 that run on fossil fuels. As you can see, those data points are way below the limit for the year 2025, so already 10 years ahead of its time. This shows us that the maritime industry, the shipping industry, is capable of way more than required by just adapting the current fossil-based technology. This should motivate us to go even further than just adapting the technology, namely exchanging it with alternatives. So what are the alternatives of maritime transport, of different propulsion systems? To generate propulsion, we can use either electric motors or internal combustion engines. Electric motors can draw their power from batteries or from fuel cells. Fuel cells can be operated with synthetic fuels. The same applies for internal combustion engines. Using synthetic fuels based on renewable energy makes the propulsion sustainable, considering the other sustainable criteria as we heard before. So we always want to use renewable energy as direct as possible. In this case, would be directly from the battery. And we have stated that there is constructive space on ships to exchange current propulsion systems with alternatives. So we could just argue, well, then let's just build a huge battery on board that runs the electric motor, and all problems within maritime transport are solved. This is actually happening on ferries and on ships that cover short distances. But let's have a look at the distribution of fuel consumption across various shipping types. So really prominent with 87% is international shipping. This is nearly always transoceanic shipping. So what would happen if we sent an electric container ship over the Atlantic Ocean? While cruising at 22 knots, which is more or less an average speed, we would need more than half of all the containers for just the battery storage. Reducing the speed to 11 knots drops the energy consumption and the needed space for battery storage significantly. But the costs for just the batteries are still 3 times as high as the costs for the whole ship. So it is really difficult to avoid the use of synthetic fuels or to avoid energy stored chemically. How can we make this sustainable? Using synthetic fuels based on renewable energy. So let's have a look at the options of synthetic fuels in maritime transport. We generally distinguish between drop-in and non-drop-in fuels. Drop-in fuels are fuels that can be used in conventional engines and thus do not need large changes in infrastructure. The drop-in fuels that are being discussed right now in maritime transport are e-diesel and e-LNG. On the other side, the non-drop-in fuels, e-hydrogen, e-ammonia, and e-methanol, all have in common that they can be used in fuel cell and an internal combustion engine. So right now we have an overview of 8 different options. And I have to tell you, this list is not complete. So yeah, how do we proceed with all those different options? Well, we take all those different options and assess them on key facts. To begin with, we analyze how much renewable energy we need for the production of the synthetic fuel. We then look at changes of infrastructure that need to be done, refitting of motors and tanks and ships, as well as changes of infrastructure in ports, for example. We want to be sure that our fuel is safe to use, and we want investments in this technology to be attractive, to find the best option of sustainable propulsion. We did this in our own assessment, and we came to the conclusion that e-diesel as a drop-in fuel offers a great short-term solution. There's no need to refit the current fleet of ships, as it is a drop-in fuel, and e-diesel is considered as a no-regret option, since synergies with other industries can be formed. Industries like, for example, the aviation industry. But e-diesel has a high demand of renewable energies in a well-to-wake analysis. This is the reason why we need as well another long-term solution. E-ammonia offers a great efficiency from well to wake. Actually, in recent times, there have been various studies published on direct ammonia fuel cells, and they all stated a really high efficiency value. This is really promising for the usage on ships. Moreover, it is easy to storage ammonia as its volumetric and gravimetric density is really high. But ammonia is highly toxic, and its application as a fuel is just starting right now. This problem does not only apply for ammonia, but for the other assessed synthetic fuels as well. This gives us, in general, a thin database to work with, and it makes, obviously, the assessment more difficult. And having in mind the plan to reduce the overall emissions by at least 50% until the year of 2050, we must act now. Why is that so? Because ships are normally operated for 25 to 30 years. And this means that ships being built today are still in operation in 2050. It is actually overdue to try out new technology and to evaluate their functionality. Hence the call for action. We must go out and try in real life applications and assess our assumptions to reassess them and to adapt as soon as possible to find our sustainable propulsion. With this, I thank you for the attention and pass the word back to Carla, I think, yes.
Thank you very much, Lukas. That was a very interesting insight into the shipping sector and how we can defossilize it. My first question would be looking at the status quo. So where are we currently? What is the current situation? Are there already ships fueled with PtX or e-fuels? And if no, when does it start, also in terms of infrastructure development?
Yes, thanks for this question. Really interesting. Actually, I brought some pictures from vessels that are using alternative options. I will show you the two options I show. So on the left side, we have the ship that's called Pretty Future from a Greek producer, from a Greek ship owner, and that's actually the world's first ammonia-ready vessel. And yeah, as you can see, it's 274 meters long, and it actually got delivered just a couple of months ago. So as you can see, the application of ammonia as fuel is just starting right now, and we need those ships to gather more information to see if the problems that we know that exist right now are as big as we assume, and or even bigger, or not as big. So it's really important to gather those data, this data to keep on assessing. On the right side, we have a ferry, as mentioned. Ferries have a different itinerary, right? This ferry, for example, from Norway, has a 30-minute drive and does so 20 to 24 times a day, and runs on pure electric. This gives the ship the possibility to recharge every time it has completed its 30-minute journey, and this ship is operating for now a year. And those are, for example, two options that are in the waters right now, but it's really important to have more ships, and not just electric and ammonia-based ships, but other options as well, to just get more data.
Thank you very much. Then we have another question from a participant. So the question is, what are e-hydrogen, e-diesel, and e-ammonia? Does the E just indicate that it is a synthetic fuel?
Yes, exactly. So e-ammonia, or let's take ammonia, can be produced with different techniques. For example, to produce ammonia, really famous is the Haber-Bosch technique, and this is based, well, I'm not 100% sure, but it's based on natural gas. And using e-ammonia shows that that the production was based on energy, and in the course of sustainability, this always means renewable energy. And that's the way how we can distinguish conventional produced ammonia and sustainably produced ammonia, called e-ammonia. That's what the E stands for. And this applies for all the other fuels as well. So if we talk about e-diesel, we have the conventional way to produce diesel, but if we talk about e-diesel, that's synthetic diesel produced with renewable energy.
Thank you very much for this clarification. And with that, I would like to close our session. I thank all the speakers very much for the presentations. It was very interesting. I hope the audience enjoyed it as well and got a good insight about what PtX, or what role PtX plays in the transport sector. And the PtX Hub is also working on a training module geared towards decision makers in the transport field. So if you want to learn more about the PtX Hub and its activities, you can visit our website or follow us on LinkedIn. And I'm wishing all of you a very nice day and enjoy the rest of the Transport and Climate Change Week. And to be able to listen to the next session about the transport emission disaggregation tool, I ask you to refresh the page. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.